Hello everyone, it's Elizabeth from The Smart Stitcher. In this week's video I'm going to be taking you through the types of stitches that I'm using to help me create my moccasin slipper. So this video is just to help sort of get you familiar with the stitches, to show you what they look like, and to, as always, have a little bit of practice. So let's get underway. The first stitch I'm going to show you is a baseball stitch, and this is really good for coming up the back seam of your moccasin boot because it allows the two layers to butt together so that they lie flat against the foot. So that is your baseball stitch on the back seam, and that's the first one that we'll do. The second one that we're going to do is actually a little bit like an overstitch, and sometimes this has different names. You might know it by oversewing, whipped oversewing, streetly stitch. It's basically sort of oversewing but going through each stitch twice rather than just once. And we use that stitch to join the sole and the upper pieces together. And we also do a slight variation on that where we are creating a few sort of little sort of puckers around the toe and around the heel. So I'm going to show you sort of two variations, one to help create some little puckers which we sew as we go along, and the second way just to do it on the straight. So just let me zoom in and show you. So you'll see here that one edge is completely straight and one edge is where I've got a few little sort of puckers and wrinkles. Now for some styles of moccasins, if you've got quite a lot of sole to ease into your moccasin upper, you'll probably have your puckers just sort of next to each other, nice, small and regular. For the pattern that I've got here, I've actually sort of spaced them out a little bit more because there's not as much leather to ease in. So in effect I've done a pucker, I've then sort of done an ordinary stitch, and I've done another pucker, so I've spaced them out a little bit more so we don't end up with lots of bunching in one particular area. So baseball stitch is the stitch that we're using on the back seam, and for the purposes of the tutorial here I've done 3 stitches at the start and 3 stitches at the end to secure my thread. With baseball stitch you're coming out of your leather but you're weaving your way up to draw both sides together. Now I've used the example here where I've started at number 1, so I will push my needle through, and I am going to show you this in just a moment. Come out at number 2 and I'll repeat that for 2 more times. So I've got 3 stitches there. When my needle comes out at the point number 2 for the final time, I will then basically come out and I'll tuck under the layer of leather on this side and go to point 3, come out again, this time going in through the gap between the 2 layers into the left hand side, coming out at number 4, and I will repeat that all the way up, going from side to side until I get to the end of my sewing, which is up here, which is when I will do those 3 stitches on the spot to secure my thread and to finish off the end. Whilst it is possible to use sewing clips to hold everything together, sometimes it can also be quite useful to tack your layers together as well, and that might depend on the nature and the type of the stitch that you're doing. To tack your layers, and I personally prefer to sort of tack because it means I don't have to worry about my thread getting caught around my clips all the time. So I'm using a between needle size 10 and an ordinary polyester sewing thread which I've waxed, and I'm pushing my needle through from the back to the front, and I'm just going to bring enough thread through, leaving a short tail, and I'm then going to tie a knot and then secure the thread, and I can move along, replace the clip with a knot and then carry on. So I would probably put these maybe 5 or 6 centimeters apart. If I was sewing something quite tricky, I would probably put them a little bit closer together. So just repeating that process. You can use a reef knot, granny knot, whichever knot you prefer, and that just helps to add a bit of extra security to hold everything in place. And then once you're done, and I'll probably put one more in because this is the baseball stitch piece of leather, we're then going to take our clips away and we're going to start sewing, but I'm just going to pop an extra final tacking stitch in this end. So we're all tacked and ready to go. Now I'm going to start off by doing my 3 stitches at the base, just as we did in the diagram earlier, and I'm just pushing my needle through from the back to the front, and I'm going to repeat that further until I've got 3 stitches there. Now for this particular bit I'm using a betweens number 5, which is a little bit bigger, and it's quite a good needle to go through some of the thicker leathers. I find betweens quite good for things like gloving and for certain aspects of leather work because they are a little bit stronger and don't sort of bend as much as embroidery needles do when you're pushing them through stronger substances. So I've done my 3 stitches, so I can then just trim off my tail, and this is where we start our baseball stitch. So my thread is out here on that left hand side. Now I find it helpful to turn it upside down when I'm going towards my right, just to get my eye in, and I'm sort of eyeballing it, but I'm roughly probably 3/4 mils, no more than 5 mils away from that first stitch, and I'm going to pull my needle through. So I've gone under that single layer and I've come out on the right hand side, and I'm just going to pull that tight. Now it's going to feel a little bit strange when you first start doing this stitch, because you'll find that when you're stitching sort of stitches 3, 4 and 5, that stitches 1 and 2 will eventually tighten and settle. I'm now going to keep my leather this way up, and I'm going to work my way up, and again I'm leaving that same sort of 3, probably 4 mil. I think it's probably between 4 and 5. I say 3, but it doesn't look quite 3, does it? So again, pulling that nice and tight, and your first few stitches will always sort of feel a little bit strange, but then they will eventually start to settle. So every time I am going to the right, I've actually turned my work upside down, and every time I go to the left, I'm sewing from the right way up. Now there are different schools of thought that say you should always keep your work so it's always the right way up when you're looking at it, but I found to sort of go to the right and get my needle at the right angle was a bit of a commotion. So if I was to try and do that now, it just doesn't sort of flow naturally for me. So I'm just working my way along, and I'm going to take my tacking stitch out when I reach it, but I'm not sort of pulling this so that it's suddenly really tight. I might sort of just go back and ease a few stitches if they look a bit loose. But I want the leather to butt together so that in effect we get a really nice seam along the ankle on the back of the leg. So you can see now that that's starting to look nice and flat. So I'm going to continue on. I'll remove my tacking stitches as I get to them, and when I get to the top I will be finishing with those 3 stitches again. As I'm sewing and working my way along, I want the edges of the leather to actually be butting up against each other so they're nice and flat as I make my way up. If I'm pulling it too tight, I'll know because this section will start to really wrinkle. So as you're sewing, make sure that if it's really wrinkling, then you know there's something wrong with your tension. You want the pieces to butt up against each other. There will be a little bit of give because there's give in the leather, but you shouldn't be able to pull them apart and see any daylight. So as you're sort of pulling them tight, give them a really good tug, and you'll notice that the stitches just behind the one you've just finished will also tighten a little bit as well. So keep sort of just working your way up, and just bear in mind if it's wrinkling, it's not a good sign. We've completed our baseball stitch, we've arrived at the top, and I have just done my 3 stitches to finish my thread off. Now one of the things that's quite helpful with leatherwork is to hammer your stitches after you have sewn some leather, just to help flatten them out. Now it's useful to do this against a hard surface or a surface that isn't going to sort of bounce around. I've got a cobbler's last, which is quite handy for this. So I'm just going to make sure that I've got my leather nicely on there, and I am just going to hammer and just flatten everything out. That just helps to flatten your starting and finishing stitches, and just to help sit the stitches nicely within the leather. For teaching purposes within this video, I'm actually using different colour threads so that they can easily be seen, and whilst I'm sort of sewing, I can explain what I am doing. When you are sewing, you might wish to use a thread that matches your leather, or you can indeed go for a contrast. For the purposes of teaching, I find it quite useful to use something that the camera will be able to pick up easily. For my actual moccasin, I used a brown thread that matched the leather so that it was suitably invisible. The next stitch we're going to look at is the whipped oversewing, or whipped over stitch, or streetly stitch, whichever you wish to prefer to call it. And I've got my leather tacked and ready, and again I'm using a different colour and something that contrasts with the leather so you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to start and finish in the same way with my 3 stitches at the top and bottom, and I'm then going to oversew everything twice. So I'm going to just start by taking my needle through. I'm using again a Gutterman's Mara and a Betweens number 5, and the thread I've also waxed that as well. But basically starting with those 3 stitches, and sometimes it's quite nice just to wiggle that thread tail out of the way a little bit. But basically I want my starting stitches nice and close, if not on top of one another, and then I'm going to start sewing. So I'm going to get rid of that tail, and I'm going to pull that up and snip that off. Now, if you're familiar with oversewing, you'll be very familiar with this, and all we're going to do is to work our way along, and I'm coming from the back to the front, and I'm just going to go through each stitch twice. So pull that nice and tight, then I'm going to move along to the next one. I think I can get one more in before I can take my tacking out. So coming through from the back to the front just the once, and then a second time, and if you can, you're going through the same set of holes. So we can take our tacking out, and I'm basically now going to work my way up and finish with my 3 stitches at the end. And here we have our finished oversewing, all hammered and nice and flat and ready for action. And this one has a little bit more of a seam because it doesn't sort of butt together and lie flat, but it's very useful for joining the moccasin upper to the sole, and it's very, very similar in fact to our next stitch, which is the same version. So it's a whipped oversewing, but this time we are just adding in some puckers, and I've got an old sort of mock-up from my pattern development that I'm actually going to use to show you how we get those puckers in position. So with our oversewing, we're going to now look at the toe section of our moccasin, and this is where we've got our upper, which is the sort of bit that you can see facing the camera here, and I've got the sole underneath. Now as we look at it, there's quite a bit of an excess to be stitched down, and one of the things that's quite important is that that is stitched down nice and evenly. Now what I've added to my pattern to help with that is a couple of markings. So I've already got the centre line that I've drawn, and the sort of obviously the horizontal line there, but where the foot started to curve I added another line on my pattern, and also on the outside of the foot, just sort of beyond the little toe where the foot started to straighten up, so that I've added another marking there just to help me get the toes in position. On my sole pattern, again, I've got another couple of marks that just help me identify where I would need to start adding my puckers. Now we're always going to start at the toe and we're going to work out, so I know that between this centre point and the point on my left here, I need to make sure that the excess sits and is stitched in between those 2 points. When I come to the other side, I've got a slightly sort of wider section, so again I will make sure that between my sort of tacking stitches, because I've tacked where my marks were, this will need to be sort of stitched in to that particular section of the moccasin. Now the good news is that we're going to start and finish our stitches in exactly the same way as we've already done, so with our 3 stitches, and it's kind of one of those things that I can suggest ways of holding it, but as you get into the technique you might well find that you adapt that so that it's easier for you to work and to sort of get a grip with. So I'm going to just pop my needle through, and again I'm using my sort of tacking stitch as a guide. If that's facing diagonal or it's sort of moving, then I know that perhaps the mark has shifted slightly, so I'm just going to make sure that my tacking stitch is nice and straight, and then I'm going to do my starting stitches. Now with the pattern of the stitches on this particular style of moccasin, we're not puckering every stitch, we're actually puckering kind of almost every other stitch or something in that vein. I'll miss out a couple of stitches and then do a pucker, because it may well depend on the size of the pattern and also the leather that you're using as to how much or how little you might be adding in. So I'm just going to do one more for luck, and then we are going to do our first stitch. But for this one I'm actually just going to keep it, the leather's edges nice and level, and I'm going to just go through and do my 2 oversewing. So I'm probably making sure that my stitches are no more than 1/2 centimetre apart, and I'm somewhere between 3 to 4 millimeters from the edge of the leather, and I'm going to keep that kind of distance whichever bit I'm stitching. So I've done my first stitch, I've pulled that nice and tight, and now what we're going to do is to just do, I know I could do a massive one like that, but that would actually have a really big effect on the toe. We're actually just going to slide a little bit of the sole against the upper to create a very, very small pucker. So I'm still keeping my stitch pattern and my sort of stitch length as I have done with my previous stitches, and then I'm just going to lock that one in place with that second oversew. My next stitch, whoops, if it does wobble a bit, just get that out of the way, and we can cut the tail off as well in a moment. So basically we're going to do our straight stitch now, and we're going to pull that tight, and then we are going to do another little pucker. And what this is helping to do is just to ease the sole of the moccasin into the slipper. Again, I don't want to make it terribly large because it will be fairly obvious when we turn the shoe, the slipper the right way out. So again, sort of small is beautiful, as it were. So that's all we're going to do. Now when we get round to the straight bit, where the edge is straight, I know that I don't have to worry about any puckers there. I'm just going to work my way along and just evenly work in between my markers so that I know that I'm getting either the toes or the heel curved and stitched into the moccasin. And that's it for this particular stitch really. So I will keep going until I run out of thread, but I'm sort of doing one straight stitch and then picking it up with one very small pucker. So you can, you know, the smaller you can keep your puckers the better, because you'll get a nice sort of balance around the curve of the foot. If you sort of feel you've gotten a bit large with one, then just unthread your needle and pull it out and then carry on sewing. So we're just going to keep that pattern all the way around to sew in our excess, and then once I will get to the straight edge, again I'll probably finish the thread off on somewhere on the straight side here, come over and repeat the process and do exactly the same on the other side. So let me do my straight stitch here, and that's all it is. So pucker and then straight stitch, pucker and then straight stitch. It can be tempting to try and make them nice and big, but that will make them really obvious. So the more discreet you can be, the better. If your thread happens to snap, then you might need to take out a few stitches to where you can get about 10 centimeters or so to finish your thread off. If you find that you run out of thread, again stop when you get to your last 10 centimeters, finish your thread off, start a new thread in exactly the same way, and that is how you will then gather the puckers around the toe and the heel of your moccasin. I would always advise having a little practice. So if you have making yourself a mock-up, then practice this on some scrap bits of leather, and definitely practice before you start using any of the leather that you want to make your slippers out of. So there we go. If you find that you have eased all of your sole into your upper and before you get to your marker, then you just carry on and straight stitch all the way down. So don't sort of worry if you kind of feel, oh, I've got little ones and suddenly I've kind of run out of sole to ease. Then that's absolutely fine. You can see mine has little puckers there, and they're absolutely fine. It's when they get really big that it becomes a problem, because when you turn it the right way out, you would always see that around the toe and it won't look as smooth. So that's something we kind of want to avoid. But if you happen to do all your easing and you've got a couple of centimeters, don't worry, just level the edges and work your way along with your straight stitch. When we start to come back the other way, it's exactly the same kind of process really, except we're just working by pushing the excess towards where we've started. So coming the other way, again, don't be tempted to sort of make massive puckers, because that will just cause problems when you turn the moccasin the right way out. We want to get just a little pucker in there, and again, the smaller the better. And we're going to work the same pattern. So we'll make a pucker, we'll do a straight stitch, make a pucker, miss one as it were, and then just keep going in that way. So I'm not bringing a massive amount of leather together. I want my sole to be kind of eased in so that it's nice and balanced all the way around. So I'm just keeping it a nice firm grip, and then just very gently just puckering up. So I'm kind of not going any bigger than any of my previous ones, and then we're holding them in position with our sewing. And that's the basis of what we're doing here. The key thing really is to always start from the center and work out, center and work out, and exactly the same on the heel as well. So just keep that pattern and aim to keep your stitches consistent in terms of their line and length. And again, once I have got around the toe, if I realise I've stitched in all my excess before I get to my tacking stitch, that's absolutely fine, as long as I've got a nice even pattern around the toe here. So I'll just keep going, and if I then get to the straight edge, then all I do is keep the stitching pattern the same, just not using the pucker obviously, because then we don't need to do that on the straight sides. So I'll make sure that I get round the toe, and it can be useful just to put your needle into the leather a little bit, just so you've got the scope to then sort of move the leather about a little bit easier, and you can always push it away from you to create that pucker as well. So I've just finished coming around the other side of the toe, and I've taken off my tacking stitches. It was a little bit close. I was fairly close to the tacking stitch and I still had a little bit of excess, but it did eventually all kind of balance out and get tapered in. Sometimes though, you may find that you do have a bit more excess than you'd like, and you may find that you just do your puckers next to each other a little bit like those in the first bit of my sample here. So that's absolutely fine. Sometimes you do have to just adjust the method based on what you're finding with the materials that you're using. So if you need to do them next to each other, that's absolutely fine. For what I've found with this pattern, doing sort of alternating with one pucker, one flat stitch, one pucker, one flat stitch, enabled me to get a better balance around the toe and the heel. So again, sometimes you just got to go with what's in front of you.